Green River Valley, Wyoming Territory, 1838. While fellow trappers slammed together standard saddle-notched corners in 2 to 3 days, Samuel Bridger spent 8 days precisely cutting dovetail joints, each log end carved into interlocking triangular wedges. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Why waste a week on fancy corner work when rounded saddle notches had sheltered mountain men for decades? Then winter arrived with hungry bears. November through December, 600 to 900-pound grizzlies destroyed cabin after cabin, pushing against walls until saddle-notched corners separated and collapsed. Standard fireplaces failed. Trappers lost winter food stores. Some lost fingers and toes to frostbite after their shelters crumbled. But Bridger's cabin, with its triangular dovetail corners, withstood 30 minutes of fury from an 850-pound grizzly, the joints actually growing tighter under the animal's devastating force. While his neighbors fled the territory or rebuilt from ruins, Bridger's stupid corner design proved unbreakable. What did this Vermont carpenter's son understand about structural mechanics that 20 years of proven frontier wisdom had missed? Samuel Bridger knelt beside the massive ponderosa pine he'd felled 3 days earlier, his draw knife sliding precisely along the grain to strip away bark in long, curling ribbons. The morning air carried the sharp scent of fresh-cut wood and the distant sound of axes, Jim Baker and Moses Harris working their own logs 200 yards downstream. Both men had already notched their first course of corner joints using the standard saddle notch method, carving rounded grooves into log undersides that nested together like wooden spoons. By their pace, they'd have walls up within the week. Bridger set down his draw knife and reached for his square, checking the log's dimensions one final time. 7 inches diameter, bark stripped clean, no twist or bow along its 12-foot length. Perfect. He positioned his handsaw at the log's end and began cutting, not the curved groove his neighbors expected, but precise angled cuts that would form the male portion of a dovetail joint. The triangular wedge took shape slowly, 45 minutes of careful sawing and chiseling where a saddle notch required only 10. "Sam's building a damn jewelry box, by not a trapper's cabin." Baker's voice carried clearly across the valley as he paused his own work to watch Bridger's methodical progress. The Virginia-born trapper had 15 seasons in these mountains and had never seen a man spend so much time on a single corner joint. His own saddle notches were functional, fast, and had sheltered him through countless winters. Round grooves cut deep enough to provide bearing surface, logs stacked and chinked with mud and moss, the same technique French-Canadian voyageurs had used successfully for generations. Harris straightened from his own log work, wiping sweat despite the cool October air. At 50 years old, he'd survived more Rocky Mountain winters than any man in the valley, and his patience for greenhorn over-engineering had worn thin. 20 winters I've trapped these mountains," he called toward Bridger. "Never lost a cabin to anything but fire. Sam's wasting time on perfectionist nonsense when winter's coming fast." The mockery stung, but Bridger continued his precise cuts. His father had taught him timber framing in Vermont, where barn joints needed to last generations without metal fasteners. Those dovetail connections had held massive timber weights through decades of harsh New England weather, their triangular geometry converting downward loads into compression that actually tightened the joint over time. He'd seen what happened when builders rushed their corner work. The brutal winter of 1829 had collapsed 2 neighbor cabins when poorly cut saddle notches separated under wind loads, killing both families in their sleep. The technical differences were stark. Saddle notches provided approximately 12 square inches of bearing surface per joint, with contact concentrated along the curved groove's edges. Under lateral pressure, the round-on-round contact offered no mechanical resistance. Logs could slide apart horizontally with just 300 to 400 pounds of force. Bridger's dovetail joints spread the same load across 36 square inches of triangular contact surface, with the angled cuts creating a wedge effect that converted horizontal force into vertical compression. But explaining structural mechanics to men who'd survived decades using adequate methods proved futile. William Sublette rode past Bridger's construction site that afternoon, pausing to examine the intricate cornerwork with obvious skepticism. The Kentucky-born trader had operated successfully in these mountains since 1832, building functional cabins using standard techniques learned from Ohio River boatmen. "Mighty fancy work for a winter shelter," Sublette observed, studying the precisely angled cuts. "Hope all that extra time don't leave you roofing in a snowstorm." Young Kentucky Williams stopped by the following morning, drawn by curiosity about Bridger's unusual methods. At 22, the Louisville native was completing his first Rocky Mountain season and eager to learn from experienced builders. But watching Bridger spend an entire hour perfecting a single dovetail angle made little sense when conventional wisdom emphasized speed above all else. "Mr. Baker says saddle notches are plenty strong if you cut them right," Williams offered. "Says you're overthinking what every mountain man already knows." Even Pierre Chouteau, whose French-Canadian heritage included generations of log-building expertise, questioned Bridger's approach. The Montreal-born trapper had learned traditional techniques from Quebecois timberworkers who built entire logging camps using rapid saddle notch assembly. "Mon ami," Chouteau said in his accented English, "we build many cabins this way. Très bon. Your corners, they're beautiful, but winter, she comes whether we're ready or not." By mid-October, the contrast was undeniable. Baker and Harris had completed their wall logs and begun roof construction while Bridger was still cutting corners. Their saddle-notched joints showed minor gaps, quarter-inch separations that would require extensive chinking, but the structures were weather-tight and functional. Sublette's cabin stood complete with smoke curling from its chimney, proof that conventional methods delivered results. Bridger's methodical progress drew increasingly sharp comments. John Day, working his third season in Wyoming after experience in Oregon's milder climate, shook his head at the time investment. "All that precision work won't matter none if you're still building when the blizzards hit," he observed. "Better to have a rough shelter finished than a perfect one half done." The community consensus solidified against Bridger's methods. His dovetail corners might be mechanically superior in theory, but frontier survival rewarded practical results over theoretical perfection. Every day spent on elaborate joinery was a day not devoted to essential winter preparations. Firewood cutting, food preservation, equipment maintenance. The margin for error in Rocky Mountain construction was slim, and experienced trappers trusted techniques that had proven adequate under actual conditions. By late October, first snow dusted the valley peaks. Bridger's cabin finally neared completion, his dovetail corners so precisely fitted that no chinking was required between logs. The joints were works of craftsmanship, each triangular interlock tight enough to prevent even knife blade insertion. But his neighbor's practical wisdom seemed validated. Their saddle-notched cabins stood ready for winter, while Bridger had barely finished his walls. The stage was set for winter's test of competing philosophies, time-tested adequacy against perfectionist precision. November brought an early freeze that locked the Green River under 3 inches of ice and dropped nighttime temperatures to 20 below zero. The harsh conditions should have driven bears into hibernation, but something had disrupted their natural cycle. Food sources had failed across the region, berry crops devastated by late spring frost, nut harvests thin, salmon runs interrupted by unusual drought. Hungry bears postponed their winter sleep, prowling the valley in desperate search of calorie-dense cached foods that would sustain them through the denning period. William Sublette discovered this reality on the morning of November 15th when he emerged from his cabin to find his cache pit destroyed. The underground storage chamber where he'd buried 40 pounds of jerky, 15 pounds of pemmican, and 20 pounds of rendered bear fat had been completely excavated. Massive claw marks scored the frozen earth, and scattered food remnants told the story of a thorough raid. But the cache destruction was only the beginning of his problems. The 600-pound black bear had not stopped with the buried stores. Drawn by the scent of additional provisions inside Sublette's cabin, the animal had tested the building's structural integrity with methodical persistence. Bears possessed an intuitive understanding of architectural weakness, instinctively pushing against corners where structural loads concentrated. The rounded grooves of sublet's saddle-notched joints provided no mechanical resistance to lateral force. Each log rested in its neighbor's curved depression without any interlocking mechanism to prevent horizontal separation. Under 400 pounds of pushing pressure, the corner logs began to slide apart. The initial quarter-inch gaps that Sublet had considered minor construction flaws became critical failure points as the bear's weight stressed each joint beyond its load-bearing capacity. Within minutes, an entire wall section collapsed inward, logs tumbling in sequence as the saddle notches lost their tenuous connection. The bear stepped through the breach and systematically destroyed Sublet's remaining winter provisions before wandering downstream in search of new targets. Sublet surveyed the wreckage in stunned silence. His cabin's structural failure represented more than property damage. It was a complete breakdown of accepted frontier wisdom. Saddle notch construction had sheltered generations of trappers and traders throughout the North American wilderness. French voyageurs had used the technique successfully from Hudson Bay to New Orleans, and its speed of construction made it ideal for seasonal camps and temporary shelters. Yet here lay evidence that conventional methods were inadequate when confronted with determined wildlife-seeking concentrated food sources. The pattern repeated with devastating consistency over the following 2 weeks. On November 28th, Jim Baker's cabin suffered identical destruction when a black bear pushed against his northwest corner until the saddle joints separated. The Virginia trapper's 15 years of wilderness experience meant nothing when his structural knowledge proved insufficient against animal pressure he'd never previously encountered. Baker lost 30 pounds of dried buffalo meat and 10 pounds of precious salt, irreplaceable supplies that would force him to abandon his winter trap lines or face starvation. December the 3rd brought the destruction of Moses Harris's winter quarters 3 miles upstream from Bridger's location. The legendary mountain man's 20 winters of survival experience could not compensate for fundamental architectural weakness when a large black bear methodically tested his cabin's corner joints. Harris had positioned his provisions carefully inside the structure, believing 4 walls provided adequate protection from wildlife raids. The bear's demolition of his saddle-notched corners proved that assumption fatally wrong. Each failure followed identical mechanics. Bears approached the cabins during pre-dawn hours when human activity was minimal, drawn by concentrated food scents that indicated substantial cached supplies. They began with exploratory pushing against walls, quickly identifying corner joints as structural weak points. The rounded contact surfaces of saddle notches offered no resistance to horizontal displacement. Logs simply slid apart when lateral force exceeded their minimal bearing capacity. The failure threshold proved remarkably consistent across different builders and construction dates. Approximately 300 to 400 pounds of pushing force caused initial joint separation in every saddle-notched cabin. Once gaps appeared, continued pressure cascaded through adjoining joints as the structural load redistributed unevenly. Wall sections collapsed in sequence, creating openings large enough for bears to enter and thoroughly ransack interior provisions. Pierre Chouteau attempted to reinforce his cabin's corners with external bracing after witnessing the repeated failures, but his efforts proved inadequate. Traditional French-Canadian construction techniques had evolved for different environmental pressures: heavy snow loads, windstorms, seasonal flooding, but not sustained lateral force from large mammals seeking cached foods. His diagonal corner braces provided some additional support, but the fundamental weakness remained in the saddle-notch joints themselves. The psychological impact on the trapping community was profound. These men had survived countless wilderness challenges through skill, experience, and proven techniques passed down through generations of frontiersmen, yet their accumulated knowledge was failing against a threat they'd never adequately considered. Bears had always been present in the mountains, but never with such focused determination to breach human structures for food access. John Day attempted to modify his saddle notches by cutting deeper grooves and adding wooden pins to prevent lateral sliding, but his improvements came too late. The same black bear that had destroyed 3 previous cabins arrived at his location on December 12th, testing his reinforced corners with the same methodical approach that had succeeded elsewhere. Day's modifications delayed the structural failure by perhaps 15 minutes. But ultimately, the rounded joint geometry could not resist sustained lateral pressure. Young Kentucky Williams watched the systematic destruction with growing alarm. His own cabin, built using techniques learned from Ohio River flatboatmen, showed the same structural vulnerabilities that had doomed his neighbors. The saddle-notched corners that seemed perfectly adequate during construction now appeared ominously fragile when viewed through the lens of recent failures. Williams began considering abandonment of his winter trap lines rather than risk the complete loss of provisions that seemed inevitable given the continuing pattern of bear destruction. The community's confidence in traditional building methods crumbled along with their cabin walls, leaving experienced trappers questioning fundamental assumptions about wilderness construction that had guided their survival for decades. Samuel Bridger woke before dawn on December 9th to the sound of massive paws circling his cabin. Through gaps in his shuttered window, he glimpsed enormous tracks pressed deep into fresh snow, 11 inches long, 7 inches wide, with claw marks extending 4 inches beyond the pad impressions. The stride length measured 42 inches, indicating a grizzly bear of extraordinary size. Based on track depth and spacing, Bridger estimated the animal's weight at 850 pounds or more, making it significantly larger than the black bears that had destroyed his neighbors' cabins. The grizzly's approach differed markedly from previous bear encounters in the valley. Where black bears had arrived with focused hunger and departed after successful raids, this massive predator demonstrated methodical intelligence. It circled Bridger's structure 3 complete times, pausing at each corner to test the air for scent concentrations that would indicate food storage locations. The animal's behavior suggested experience with human structures, and an understanding that cabins contained concentrated provisions worth sustained effort to access. At 4:45, the testing began. The grizzly reared onto its hind legs and placed both front paws against Bridger's northeast corner, applying steady downward pressure while pushing horizontally. The force transmitted through the bear's massive shoulders and chest muscles exceeded anything the previous black bears had generated. Bridger estimated the initial pressure at 800 pounds, increasing to 1,200 pounds as the animal committed its full weight to the structural test. Inside the cabin, Bridger experienced something unprecedented in frontier construction. His dovetail corners absorbed the tremendous force without any perceptible movement or sound. No creaking timber, no wall flex, no corner separation, just absolute structural rigidity under assault that would have instantly collapsed any saddle-notched building. The triangular geometry of his joints was performing exactly as his Vermont father had taught him, converting horizontal force into vertical compression that actually tightened the corner connections. The grizzly's confusion was almost palpable. Accustomed to the immediate success that had characterized its raids on saddle-notched cabins, the massive bear encountered resistance it had never experienced. The 14-degree angles of Bridger's dovetail cuts created a mechanical advantage that redirected the animal's pushing force through the joint's triangular contact surfaces, spreading 1,200 pounds of pressure across 36 square inches instead of concentrating it along rounded groove edges. Frustrated by the corner's immobility, the grizzly began raking its claws down the cabin's log walls, leaving gouges 3 inches deep in the pine timber. The animal's claws, evolved for digging roots and tearing bark, scored parallel lines that would have weakened saddle-notch joints by reducing their already minimal contact area. But Bridger's dovetail connections remained completely unaffected by surface damage to the log faces. Their structural integrity depended on internal triangular cuts that lay far beneath the claw marks. At 5 o'clock, the bear escalated to full-body ramming. Standing 8 feet from the cabin's northwest corner, the grizzly charged with its massive shoulder leading, striking the joint with impact force that Bridger estimated at 1,500 pounds. The collision produced a dull thudding sound as the animal's momentum transferred harmlessly into the cabin's structural mass. Where saddle-notched corners would have exploded apart under such impact, Bridger's joints compressed tighter together, their wedge geometry converting destructive force into stabilizing pressure. The ramming continued for 10 minutes, each impact demonstrating the fundamental difference between rounded and triangular joint geometry. Saddle notches relied on friction and bearing surface to resist lateral force, characteristics that failed catastrophically under sudden shock loads. Dovetail joints employed mechanical interlocking that became stronger under pressure, their angled cuts preventing any possibility of horizontal separation regardless of applied force. Between ramming attempts, the grizzly clawed at the cabin's foundation logs, seeking any structural weakness that might provide access to the rich food scents emanating from within. Bridger's winter provisions included 200 pounds of cached buffalo jerky, 50 pounds of rendered bear fat, 30 pounds of dried berries, and 20 pounds of pemmican. Concentrated calories that represented survival itself in the harsh mountain environment. The grizzly's persistence reflected not mere hunger, but the desperate need for fat reserves required for successful hibernation. At 5:15, after 30 minutes of sustained assault, something remarkable occurred. The grizzly stepped back from Bridger's cabin and examined its work with obvious bewilderment. Every other structure the animal had encountered yielded to pressure within minutes, providing easy access to cached provisions. This building defied every expectation based on the bear's previous experience with human construction, remaining completely intact despite forces that had demolished 6 other cabins in the valley. The grizzly's final test involved climbing. Using its powerful claws for purchase, the enormous bear scaled Bridger's cabin wall until its front paws reached the roofline. The additional leverage should have created overwhelming stress on the corner joints as the animal's full weight hung from the log connections. Instead, the dovetail geometry distributed this vertical load through the triangular joint faces, actually increasing the mechanical advantage that held each corner together. Unable to comprehend the structural principles that made Bridger's cabin impregnable, the grizzly abandoned its assault. The animal's departure at dawn left behind dramatic evidence of its efforts: deep claw gouges in every wall, compressed snow around the foundation, impact marks where full body ramming had failed to budge the corners. But the structure itself remained absolutely unchanged, its dovetail joints showing no damage. No separation, no compromise of their mechanical integrity. Bridger's morning inspection revealed the stark contrast between destructive intent and structural reality. The grizzly had applied more force to his corners than any building in the valley had previously withstood, yet his cabin showed no functional damage. Claw marks and impact evidence decorated the exterior, but the fundamental architecture remained completely sound, a testament to precision joinery techniques that his neighbors had dismissed as unnecessary perfectionism. The test was complete, and the results undeniable. While conventional wisdom lay in ruins throughout the Green River Valley, one man's commitment to structural excellence had created the only bear-resistant building in 800 square miles of wilderness territory. The same grizzly that had failed against Bridger's fortress continued its rampage through the Green River Valley with methodical determination. On December 12th, the massive bear arrived at John Day's reinforced cabin just after midnight, drawn by the scent of cached venison and elk tallow stored beneath the floorboards. Day had spent precious daylight hours after witnessing the previous destructions, attempting to strengthen his saddle-notched corners with additional wooden pins and deeper groove cuts, modifications that represented his best understanding of structural improvement within conventional building methods. The grizzly's assault on Day's cabin demonstrated the futility of surface modifications to fundamentally flawed joint geometry. Despite the deeper grooves and reinforcing pins, the rounded contact surfaces still provided no mechanical resistance to lateral force. The bear's initial pushing pressure of 800 pounds immediately stressed the joints beyond their load-bearing capacity, causing the wooden pins to shear and the deeper grooves to split under concentrated pressure. Within 12 minutes, Day's reinforced southwest corner collapsed entirely, logs tumbling inward as the cascading failure spread through adjoining joints. Day emerged from the wreckage with severe frostbite injuries to both feet after 3 hours of exposure in 20 below temperatures while seeking shelter at a neighbor's destroyed cabin. The medical consequences were immediate and permanent, blackened toes that would require amputation within days. Ending his career as a mobile trapper in terrain that demanded sure footing across treacherous mountain slopes, His testimony later documented the direct connection between architectural failure and life-threatening injury, transforming cabin corner design from a construction preference into a documented survival issue. 4 days later, the Grizzly demolished Pierre Chouteau's cabin, despite the French-Canadian's external corner bracing. Chouteau had installed diagonal timber supports based on traditional Quebec construction methods, used to reinforce buildings against heavy snow loads and wind pressure. These external modifications provided some additional structural stability, but they could not compensate for the fundamental weakness of saddle-notched joints under sustained lateral force. The Bears' methodical destruction of Chouteau's corner braces demonstrated that surface reinforcement was inadequate when the core joint geometry remained unchanged. On December 18th, Kentucky Williams made the pragmatic decision that saved his life. Rather than wait for the inevitable destruction of his own saddle-notched cabin, the young trapper abandoned his winter trap lines and began the dangerous journey to Fort Bridger, 60 miles through mountain passes already clogged with early snow. Williams carried only essential survival gear, leaving behind 40 pounds of processed furs and 30 pounds of winter provisions rather than risk the complete loss that had befallen every other conventional cabin in the valley. The psychological impact of Williams's retreat resonated throughout the remaining trapping community. Here was a young, strong frontiersman with adequate shelter and sufficient provisions choosing exile over confrontation with structural realities beyond his control. His departure represented an admission that traditional building knowledge was insufficient for current environmental pressures, forcing older, more experienced trappers to confront the possibility that their accumulated wilderness wisdom contained critical gaps. The numerical evidence had become undeniable through bitter experience. 7 saddle-notched cabins had been tested by hungry bears since November, with a destruction rate of 100%. Structural failure occurred consistently at lateral forces between 300 and 400 pounds, regardless of builder experience, construction variations, or reinforcement attempts. Corner gaps that seemed minor during construction became catastrophic failure points when stressed beyond the minimal bearing capacity of rounded groove connections. In stark contrast, Bridger's single dovetail cornered cabin had withstood forces exceeding 4,000 pounds without any structural damage or joint separation. The mechanical advantage created by his 14-degree triangular cuts converted destructive lateral pressure into stabilizing vertical compression, creating a corner system that actually grew stronger under assault. His construction time investment, 64 hours for corner joints compared to 16 hours for conventional methods, had produced structural integrity that proved literally invaluable when survival depended on architectural performance. The surviving trappers began gathering informally at Bridger's cabin for evening discussions, not merely because it was the only intact structure large enough to accommodate groups, but because its demonstrated invulnerability provided psychological comfort that their own compromised shelters could not offer. These conversations inevitably focused on technical comparisons between failed and successful construction methods, with experienced frontiersmen examining dovetail joint mechanics for the first time in their careers. Moses Harris, whose legendary status in the mountain trade made his opinions influential throughout the region, began acknowledging publicly that his previous dismissal of Bridger's methods had been premature. "Never seen corner joints that actually get stronger under attack," Harris admitted during a December 19th gathering. His statement represented a fundamental shift in community thinking from dismissing Bridger's precision work as unnecessary perfectionism to recognizing it as superior engineering validated by empirical testing. Jim Baker's conversion proved equally significant for the adoption of dovetail construction techniques. The Virginia trapper's 15 seasons of wilderness experience gave him credibility among newer arrivals who might otherwise dismiss structural innovations as unproven experimentation. Baker's detailed examination of Bridger's corner joints, combined with his first-hand experience of saddle notch failure under bear pressure, provided compelling testimony that convinced skeptical trappers to abandon traditional methods in favor of demonstrably superior alternatives. The community consensus began shifting from mockery to respect for proven engineering principles. Bridger's willingness to invest additional construction time in structural fundamentals was no longer viewed as excessive perfectionism, but as essential preparation for environmental challenges that conventional wisdom had failed to anticipate. His 8 days of precise corner cutting had created the difference between winter survival and catastrophic loss of provisions that meant death in the Rocky Mountain wilderness. By December 20th, practical necessity had overcome traditional resistance to innovation. The surviving trappers formally requested instruction in dovetail construction techniques, transforming Bridger from community outcast to essential teacher whose knowledge meant the difference between successful wintering and territorial abandonment. The man they had ridiculed for building too slowly had become the only builder whose methods had proven adequate when ultimate testing arrived. The winter of 1838 through 39 became known throughout the Rocky Mountain fur trade as the season that changed building forever. Word of Bridger's bear-resistant construction spread along trap lines and trading posts from Fort Laramie to South Pass, carried by survivors who had witnessed the systematic destruction of conventional cabins and the miraculous survival of dovetail-cornered structures. Jim Baker emerged as the technique's most effective advocate, teaching the method to incoming trappers with the fervor of a man whose life had been saved by superior knowledge. Baker's instruction sessions that spring focused on the critical 14-degree angle that created optimal mechanical advantage without requiring excessive precision during field construction. Using hand tools available to wilderness builders, crosscut saws, broad axes, and wooden-handled chisels, he demonstrated how to cut triangular joints that would interlock with the same structural integrity Bridger had achieved. The angle measurement proved crucial. Cuts steeper than 16 degrees became too difficult for field craftsmen to execute consistently, while angles shallower than 12 degrees provided insufficient wedge effect to resist lateral pressure. Moses Harris carried the technique eastward when he guided a wagon train of Mormon immigrants along the Oregon Trail in 1841. His detailed knowledge of dovetail construction, gained through bitter experience in the Green River Valley, proved invaluable when the emigrants required bear-resistant storage buildings at their winter camp near Fort Bridger. Harris supervised the construction of 12 supply cabins using triangular corner joints, creating the first systematic application of the technique beyond its original testing ground. The Mormon emigrants' adoption of dovetail construction established a crucial documentation trail that preserved the method's technical specifications for future builders. Brigham Young's meticulous record-keeping included precise descriptions of joint angles, cutting sequences, and structural outcomes that validated the technique's effectiveness across diverse construction scenarios. These records reached Eastern carpentry schools by 1845, introducing dovetail corner construction to trained craftsmen who could refine and standardize the method for wider application. Pierre Chouteau's bilingual documentation proved equally important for spreading the technique among French-speaking trappers and traders throughout the Great Lakes region. His detailed letters to Montreal fur trading houses described the structural failures of conventional saddle notch construction and the superior performance of triangular joints under animal pressure. These communications, written in both French and English, crossed cultural barriers that might otherwise have prevented adoption of American building innovations by European-trained craftsmen. The technique's effectiveness became statistically undeniable as more builders adopted dovetail construction throughout the 1840s and 50s. Wildlife encounters that would have destroyed saddle-notched buildings left dovetail-cornered structures completely intact, creating survival rates that transformed frontier construction practices across Bear Territory regions. Trading posts from Hudson Bay to California began requiring dovetail corners for any structure containing valuable stored goods, making the technique a standard specification rather than an optional improvement. John Day's permanent disability from frostbite injuries sustained during his cabin's collapse created a powerful advocate for structural safety in frontier construction. Despite losing 2 toes and ending his active trapping career, Day spent his remaining years teaching dovetail techniques to emigrants and new trappers entering Bear Territory regions. His first-hand testimony about the medical consequences of architectural failure carried weight that purely technical arguments could not achieve, convincing builders that corner joint selection was literally a matter of life and death. The technique reached the California goldfields in 1849 through mountain men who had learned dovetail construction during their Rocky Mountain careers. Miners' supply cabins built with triangular corners survived bear raids that destroyed conventional structures throughout the Sierra Nevada, protecting accumulated gold and essential provisions from wildlife seeking concentrated food sources. The economic impact proved substantial. Successful miners could maintain their claims through winter seasons, instead of abandoning valuable diggings due to structural failures. Kentucky Williams returned to the Green River Valley in 1852 as a successful businessman, having parlayed his early dovetail training into a profitable construction enterprise serving Oregon Trail emigrants. His transformation from failed conventional builder to expert craftsman demonstrated the educational pathway that made the technique accessible to newcomers without extensive carpentry backgrounds. Williams's standardized instruction methods reduced the learning curve from weeks to days, enabling rapid adoption across the expanding frontier. The United States Army adopted dovetail corner construction for frontier outposts after documenting the superior performance of triangular joints in hostile environments where structural integrity meant military survival. Fort specifications written in 1857 mandated dovetail corners for all buildings containing ammunition, provisions, or essential supplies, creating government endorsement that validated the technique's effectiveness beyond civilian applications. Modern engineering analysis conducted in the 1970s confirmed the empirical observations of 19th century builders. Computer modeling demonstrated that 14-degree dovetail angles provided optimal load distribution under lateral stress, validating Bridger's intuitive understanding of structural mechanics through scientific measurement. The mathematical principles underlying triangular joint geometry matched perfectly with field observations recorded by trappers who had witnessed the technique's performance under actual environmental pressures. The National Park Service began using dovetail construction for backcountry structures in bear habitat during the 1980s, recognizing that Bridger's innovation remained the most effective method for creating wildlife-resistant buildings using traditional materials and hand tools. Modern implementations of the technique in places like Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks demonstrated that 19th century structural principles continued to outperform contemporary alternatives when environmental challenges demanded proven solutions. Samuel Bridger's philosophy, preserved in diary entries discovered in 1943, captured the mindset that created lasting innovation from temporary necessity. "Measure twice, cut once, and cut it right," he wrote in 1841. "Time spent in precision work today saves your life tomorrow." A corner joint that fails under pressure ain't worth the wood it wastes. These words became the unofficial motto of traditional builders, who understood that structural integrity could not be compromised when survival depended on architectural performance in unforgiving environments where failure meant death. The technique that neighbors once dismissed as unnecessary perfectionism had evolved into standard practice across North America, saving countless lives through superior structural engineering that transformed wilderness construction from adequate to excellent.